My previous video covered a wish list of 10 ways that I think the developers at Axis Games can improve the on-field gameplay of their Axis football video games in order to keep them competitive in a growing market of football video games, both indie and big budget. The strength of Axis football the past few years has been its deep franchise mode. Well, relatively deep, for an indie game anyway. So this video is going to go through another 10 ideas that I have for improving that franchise mode. The hope is that gamers will continue to claim that Axis has a better franchise mode than Madden, even as EA finally makes upgrades to its franchise mode, whether those upgrades are actually any good or not. I spent far too long on the intro for the last video, so let's get straight into the meat of this wish list. Axis Football currently has a practice squad feature, but it doesn't really work like a real practice squad. As far as I can tell, placing a player on the practice squad does not affect their salary, and any player can be freely moved between the active roster and practice squad at any given time. It's basically just an extra 15 players on your team, but they can't be added to the depth chart. And I don't think that the CPU teams ever bother using it, probably because it's not cost effective. I pretty much only ever use the practice squad as a makeshift injured reserve, which we'll talk about in a moment. I'd like to see this feature get a little more fleshed out. It doesn't necessarily have to follow the same rules as the NFL, but it should at least have some clearly defined rules and limitations within the Axis League. My proposal is that players on the practice squad should have to have 3 years of experience in the league or less, and they should be paid a set salary that is lower than the minimum salary for active players, maybe $250,000. This would allow teams to be able to afford to keep players on the practice squad without going broke. I'm okay with players being able to be freely moved between the active roster and practice squad, so long as they are eligible to be placed on the practice squad, but players who are on the practice squad when the week is advanced or when the week's match is played should receive the practice squad's salary instead of their regular salary. If a player is activated from the practice squad, then he would be paid a prorated salary for each game that he is active. If returned to the practice squad, that player would go back to being paid the reduced practice squad salary. This would allow teams to keep a deeper reserve of players to develop, including those low-rated late-round draft picks. These players can also be activated in the event that injuries deplete a particular position and there are no good or affordable free agents or trades that can be done to fill those positions. And so, to go along with that practice squad improvements mentioned above, Axis should also add an actual injured reserve mechanic, so that I don't have to keep using the practice squad as an injured reserve, although I'm okay with continuing to do that in the meantime if Axis can't get around to this. At the very least, players with season-ending injuries should be able to be placed on injured reserve, which would remove them from the active roster for the duration of the season and would free up a roster spot to allow a free agent signing or to elevate a player from the practice squad. Maybe there can even be stipulations in player contracts that guarantee their salary even if they are placed on injured reserve. Otherwise, they would be subject to a reduced salary similar to being on the practice squad in order to make it so that you can actually afford to hire other players to replace them. And also so that you don't end up soft locking the franchise by being below the minimum number of required players and therefore being unable to play your next game, but without having the cash necessary to actually sign a replacement player. And I know this next idea is probably not going to be a popular idea, but I'm going to put it out there anyway, and we'll circle back to it later so that you'll see why I'm suggesting this. I would like to see some form of preseason added to Axis's franchise mode. Even if it is just 2 games, it would be nice to have an opportunity to try out newly drafted rookies, practice squad players, and other free agents in actual live game situations. Or maybe, instead of a preseason, Axis could try to differentiate itself from NFL football and also from Madden by offering the ability to schedule some kind of scrimmage matches or joint practices against opponents of your choice prior to beginning each season. The scrimmages could possibly have a different format compared to regular season games in order to differentiate themselves more from a preseason game. Maybe each team gets 10 offensive plays with starters, 10 offensive plays with reserves, and maybe a few special teams plays thrown in. I think I remember having off-season scrimmages with other teams back when I played in high school. Or like maybe it's some kind of variation of college football overtime rules where each team just gets a drive from the 25-yard line or whatever with their starters, and then you switch sides, and then you switch sides again, but with the reserve players, and then switch sides one last time with the reserve players. Anyway, that's it for now. I'll be circling around to the idea of preseason later on in this list. To be honest, I've never really cared for real-time drafts in football video games. So when a real-time live draft was the big new franchise edition for Axis Football 20, my reaction was an eye roll and a resounding meh. I just never felt that the real-time drafts provide any meaningful actions for the user to perform that makes the time spent waiting feel like anything more than a waste of time. I can see a real-time draft maybe having some value in multi-user franchises, and maybe that's what Axis was going for, since it's probably a bit more interesting to see who the other users pick in a multi-user franchise. But let's be honest, when we play these games in single-user franchises, do you actually sit through every selection, or do you just simulate to your next pick? I'm betting the vast majority of you probably do the latter. It's certainly what I do. As such, I feel that if a football game is going to include a real-time draft, it should provide the user with some meaningful things to do while waiting for other teams' picks, and it should also probably provide some value to the user for actually paying attention to which players the other teams are picking. In my opinion, Axis Football does not do either. At the very least, the time limit between picks should serve as a time limit to force the user to have to make selections under some sort of pressure. I should be reviewing the list of available players, my team's needs, and so forth while the timer for other teams' picks ticks down, and then have to make a selection before I run out of time when my pick comes along. But that isn't even the case in Axis Football, since switching tabs away from the live draft pauses the draft, giving the user unlimited time to search every player available in preparation for making your own selection, and which then forces us to have to mindlessly stare at the CPU picks one at a time in order to progress the draft because there's nothing else that we can do in the meantime. The game should be putting the current team on the clock and their selection in a widget on the side of the screen somewhere, and then allow the user to browse the other tabs while still keeping an eye on the progress of the draft while it's happening in real time. Axis doesn't do this, so I don't see what the point of the live draft is. Not knowing who the other teams might choose with their upcoming picks is also a big problem because it negates any agency that the user might have. I don't know who the other teams are choosing until after they've made their choice, at which point it's too late for me to do anything about it. If they picked a player I wanted, too bad, so sad. There's nothing I can do. So again, what's the point of having to sit through watching these picks in real time? One way to mitigate this problem and to give the user a bit more agency in the draft process would be to include some simulated mock drafts that show the likely order in which players will be selected. This would also give the user an idea of whether my desired players will be available when my picks come around, so I'll have some indication that I might need to trade up to get the guy I want. In the game preview screen, there are avatars of 4 of Axis's developers, Danny, Joe, Dave, and James, who give predictions on the outcome of each game. So why not have each of these avatar analysts also provide their own predicted mock draft at the end of the season? The draft screen could show each analyst's mock draft prediction for the upcoming teams. However, if the game allows in-draft trading, as it should, then these projections can become completely upset by trades changing the order of teams. Thus, a better solution would be to have a real-time preview or projection of which player each of the upcoming teams is expected to pick. Maybe our 4 analysts could provide their own real-time updated projections as each pick is made, in addition to their preset mock drafts before the draft started. This way, if the user or other CPU team notices that their desired prospect is likely to be drafted by another team, we can take some meaningful action by attempting to trade up and get that specific player. This grants extra agency to the user and makes the real-time element of the draft more relevant in single-user franchises. If I simulate the draft to my next pick, I would miss these opportunities to trade up and ensure I get the players that I want. Axis Football 21 does technically allow trading during the draft, but you have to exit the draft in order to do so. You can even trade picks that have already been made, which kind of sort of resets the draft, but the chosen players aren't on the board anymore because they've already been added to the rosters of the teams that chose them. So while you technically can trade during the draft, it's not very realistic. It can actually be used to cheat, and it leads to various bugs and display issues regarding who's been chosen, who's available, and so forth. So I think it's pretty clear that Axis does not expect or want users to be exiting the draft to make trades, and so I think Axis should really add some true support for in-draft trades using these philosophies that I mentioned before for ensuring that the users feel like they have agency in how the draft unfolds. And once we're done with the draft, it then comes time for things like training camp, preseason, and player evaluation. I've brought this idea up before in the context of Madden, but not for the indie Axis football games. I would like to see a football game try out a talent evaluation feature in which the true ratings of players have to be unlocked through practice, training camp, or actual game matches. This would be a good supplement to the practice squad and preseason that I mentioned before, since the preseason would now offer teams a chance to test out their rookies, and the practice squad would become a valuable tool for keeping players on your roster while their talent is still being evaluated. How I imagine this working is that newly drafted players and younger players should have some ratings hidden, and these ratings should be gradually revealed as the player sees practice or game reps. For example, a newly drafted wide receiver might have a speed rating of A ? And a catch rating of C ? We'll know that he's fast and that he has mediocre catching skills, but we won't know precisely how fast he is or how mediocre his catching is. Axis already uses a letter grade rating system that obscures the player's true numeric ratings to the user, so there is already some ambiguity and the necessity for some judgment calls on who you start in the case of very closely rated players. This would make the ambiguity greater for young, untested players, as their rating would represent a much larger possible range. Learning their more precise ratings would then be a multi-step process. First, there should be a training camp that evaluates all players' physical attributes. It doesn't necessarily have to be a playable training camp, it could just be some kind of simulated one. This would reveal speed, agility, and strength for young players, and would also reveal progression or regression of ratings for veteran players. So do this at the end of the offseason instead of at the start of the offseason. The next step could be a preseason, in which the amount of playing time for any given player will determine if any other ratings are revealed. Then, ratings could also be revealed over the course of the regular season if the player sees any substantial playing time. Maybe he has to play a certain number of snaps to unlock a rating. Ideally, it should be possible, and in fact very likely, for teams to stash a rookie on the practice squad for 2 or 3 years and never fully unlock all of his ratings. When that player is no longer eligible for the practice squad, the coach would then have to make a judgment call. Sign this untested player with unknown ratings to one of your 53 roster spots, or cut him loose into free agency. Since he's no longer eligible for the practice squad, any team that signs that player wouldn't know his true ratings either, and would have to actually play the player in order to unlock those ratings. So, signing him would be a little bit of a gamble. In fact, as it currently stands, Axis Football 21 shows each draft prospect's actual ratings in the draft preview. This completely defeats the purpose of the in-season scouting, as you can get accurate and complete information about each prospect from the draft preview. Thanks to Wild Lion Games on YouTube for bringing up this problem in his review of Axis Football 21, because honestly, I was completely unaware of it until he pointed it out. If my idea were implemented, then this draft preview would show the estimated grades for each prospect's ratings, and the in-season scouting would actually then be relevant, as it could be used to reveal some of these specific ratings. The unknown ratings don't even necessarily have to be within the displayed grade range. Perhaps that rookie receiver's C ? Catch rating eventually gets revealed to be a B- after lots of reps in training camp and preseason, which would mean that he's a diamond in the rough, better than your scouts thought he was. This would mean that even players with a bunch of D ? ratings might actually have more potential than you think, and anybody on your roster could be a potential star in hiding. And you won't know unless you actually play that player, preferably in preseason, when the wins and losses don't matter. In order for this to work, the CPU team would also need to be programmed to have to play players in the preseason in order to unlock their ratings. There should be some logic during the preseason games for CPU teams to rotate in backups. Maybe at halftime they sub in all their second-string players, and then in the fourth quarter they start rotating in any players who still have unknown ratings. I know a lot of people would probably see preseason games as a waste of time, but having a talent evaluation system like this would hopefully make the preseason worth playing for the user. It would be an integral part of the team building and development process, and not just a meaningless extra game that doesn't count for anything and possibly gives your players season-ending injuries. And because there's only a handful of attribute ratings in the game, a shortened preseason of like 2 games makes sense, since each game could reveal 1 or 2 ratings while still leaving some left over for training camp, the regular season, and to remain locked until the following season. However, with just 2 preseason games, there's less time to evaluate young players, so perhaps the substitution logic should be that second stringers get subbed in for the second quarter instead of waiting for halftime, then play through the third quarter, and then deeper reserves get subbed in during the fourth quarter. That way, young reserves get more playing time compared to veteran starters. And of course, once in the preseason and regular season, it would also be nice for Axis's franchise mode to have more for the user to do involving game preparation. Right now, there's not much else to do besides maybe reviewing the upcoming opponent's depth chart and their injury report, neither of which is given to me. I have to go into the menus to find it. Axis should have an opponent scouting report that highlights the upcoming opponent's top players, any key injuries, coach badges, and maybe also matchups between certain position groups. For example, it could show how my top wide receiver matches up against the opponent's top cornerback and vice versa, or how my best offensive lineman matches up against their best defensive lineman, and so forth. The scouting report should also specify what playbooks the opponent uses on offense and defense, and also maybe provide a breakdown of their play calling tendencies and current season stats. All this information is present in the game, so I'm not asking the Axis developers to do anything that they aren't already doing. The problem is that the user has to go from menu to menu searching for all of this information. What I'm suggesting is that it should all be collected and shown to the user in one convenient scouting report screen that is available from the home screen of the dashboard before each game. Ideally, there should also be something useful that you can do with all this information. I suppose you could use this information to adjust your depth chart or alter your practice schedule or maybe even change up your team's play calling tendencies or audibles. To that end, there probably should be a link to the depth chart, practice screen, play calling tendencies, and audibles within the scouting report. But it would be nice if there were more to do in response to the scouting report. An open practice mode that allows you to practice offensive and defensive plays against your opponent's playbooks would be a good start, but there's not really enough variety in playbooks yet for this to really be meaningful. In any case, it would still be convenient to have all that opponent information collected and available in one place, even if there's not a whole lot that you can do with it. I'd also like to see some small changes with how the current practice intensity settings work. Currently, changing the practice intensity provides a linear growth in point allocations. Each step of intensity grants, I think, 8 points for your practice schedule. The only downside to increasing practice intensity is that it increases the risk of injury for players during the upcoming game, and it increases morale loss if you lose the game. Why did we work so much harder just to lose the game anyway? The injury risk is actually a pretty substantial deterrent to extreme intensity practicing, especially over repeated weeks. I usually see multiple long-term injuries to players after completing a match with extreme practice intensity. Heavy intensity will result in more minor to moderate injuries, and these can also be mitigated by reducing the injury frequency in the game settings. Personally, I feel like increasing the practice intensity should also come with diminishing returns as an additional deterrent to practicing too hard. It should provide less reward at much greater risk. Instead of granting 8 additional points for heavy and extreme intensity each, perhaps going from normal to heavy should only grant 6 additional points, and going from heavy to extreme should only add 4 additional points. This way, even with extreme practice, you still can't, practice everything. You would still have to choose a few things to focus your practice points on. Axis Football 19 had actually put pressure on EA's Madden football games by introducing a full coaching staff to its franchise mode. These coaches include a head coach, offensive, defense, and special teams coordinators, as well as assistant coach for each position group, and a set of 4 regional scouts. That's a whopping total of 15 coaches on your franchise staff. Madden 22 doesn't even bother to give you a special teams coordinator, let alone the assistant position coaches. Furthermore, I like that Axis actually has attribute ratings for its coaches, as well as individual talent badges, which helps make each coach feel distinct and gives them a little bit of personality, whereas Madden's new coordinators feel like completely interchangeable blank slates with pathetically shallow skill trees. So Axis definitely still has Madden beat in terms of depth when it comes to hiring a coaching staff. But Axis Football could still have more members of the coaching staff. I would like to see a team doctor and/or medical staff that can be hired, which reduces the risk of injuries to players and speeds up recovery time for players who do get injured. We could also see a strength and conditioning coach or team trainer who improves the strength, speed, agility, and fitness of players, and who improves attribute progressions for players during the offseason. There could also be a 5th opponent scout, whose responsibility is solely to study your next opponent. This staff member would improve the accuracy and detail of any opponent scouting report, and would perhaps also improve the awareness of individual players. And from a UI and user feedback perspective, it would also be really nice to have more explanation of what effects your coaches and their attribute ratings have on the team. For example, what the heck does my special teams coordinator even do? None of the coaches, not even the special teams coordinator, have attribute ratings for special teams. So which of my special teams coordinator's attribute ratings, if any, even affect my special teams players? And do those effects only apply to kickers, punters, and maybe returners? How am I supposed to even know if this coach is a good special teams coordinator or not? Or if he's any better than any of the other available coaches? This guy at least has a special teams badge, which I guess makes him a good special teams coordinator, maybe, but is he still better than the other guy? But then again, I've also seen plenty of examples of coaches that have good offensive ratings, but then have defensive badges, or vice versa. And this is even on some of the default team coaching staffs. This isn't like me hiring the wrong guy. So it'd be nice if that gets fixed. There's a whole page in the Franchise Hub that does nothing but explain all the things that affect team morale. It would be nice to have a similar page somewhere that explains what all the coach attributes do. Maybe put a help page on every one of the franchise pages that would explain what the contents of that page mean. It would certainly be helpful. And I have a bad feeling that this last suggestion is going to end up being the most controversial one, even though it's the one that should not be controversial at all. And that is for Axis Football to include the option to create women as players and coaches. Women like football. Women play football video games. They should be able to see themselves represented in these games just like we men can. Women have played Division I college football, and there are currently several active women coaching in the NFL. So the idea of women in professional football is not completely unprecedented. Axis should definitely support female coaches, since that is already a reality in professional football right now. Axis's franchise mode can extend out for decades, and it's entirely possible that a woman might make it into the league as a player within those next few decades. As such, there should be a small chance that women will appear in the Axis football draft, even if they are extremely unlikely to ever show up as anything other than kickers, and even if they aren't highly rated players, they should at least have a chance of being in the game. Over the past few years, women have becoming more actively involved in football at both the collegiate and professional level. They're not just cheerleaders and sideline correspondents anymore. Women are analysts on TV, they're broadcast announcers, they're referees on the field, they're coaches, and in the case of college football, they are playing the game with shoulder pads and a helmet and everything, just like all the boys are. And since Axis football isn't tied to a real-life football league, the teams and rosters are purely fictional. As such, Axis is not bound to real-life roster changes that happen from year to year. Because of this, I would like to see Axis include support for importing a save file from last year's game. This would allow us users to pick up in each year's new game where we left off in last year's game. We could continue developing the same team with the same players, coaches, win-loss records, championships, and so forth to try to build a true dynasty over the course of many seasons and many years of real life. This would be a good way of providing a bit of a loyalty reward to players who buy the game year after year. They'll get to keep playing their same save file and continue to make progress on that same save file without having to start over from scratch every year. Perhaps an even better way to reward loyalty would be an actual monetary discount. If possible, it would be a very generous gesture from Axis Games to include like a promo code or something for a discount towards the purchase of next year's game. For example, Axis Football 2022 on Steam could, hypothetically, come with the Steam code for, I don't know, say 25 or 50% off or whatever on the purchase of Axis Football 2023. This would be a great way of thanking Axis Football's biggest fans and also encouraging them to come back year after year and build a loyal, dedicated community that will stick with this game for the long term. Well, there you have it. Another 10 suggestions, this time for improving the franchise mode of Axis Football for the 2022 season and beyond. What do you think? Do you like the ideas that I've brought up? Will this keep people saying that Axis Football's franchise mode is better than Madden's? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you like this wish list, then please like, comment, and share the video, as well as subscribe to the channel so you can see additional content like this. And if you really liked this, then please consider supporting the creation of future content like this by becoming a patron. I intend to do one more of these wish lists, which I hope will not take nearly as long to put together as these first two. This third part will just be like bug fix requests and a few other miscellaneous things. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. I'll hope to have that out in the next couple weeks. In the meantime, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of the football season.